Philosophy and the Crisis of European Humanity, the Vienna Lecture, by Edmund Husserl. 2. But now we must listen to those certainly very pressing misunderstandings and objections which, it seems to me, derive their suggestive force from fashionable prejudices and their phraseologies. Is it not the case that what we have presented here is something rather inappropriate to our time, an attempt to rescue the honor of rationalism, of enlightenment, of an intellectualism which loses itself in theories alienated from the world, with its necessary evil consequences of a superficial lust for erudition and an intellectualistic snobism? Does this not mean that we are being led again into the fateful error of believing that science makes man wise, that it is destined to create a genuine and contented humanity that is master of its fate? Who would still take such notions seriously today? This objection certainly has its relative merit in relation to the state of the European development from the 17th to the end of the 19th centuries, but it does not apply to the proper sense of my presentation. I would like to think that I, the supposed reactionary, am far more radical and far more revolutionary than those who in their words proclaim themselves so radical today. I, too, am certain that the European crisis has its roots in a misguided rationalism, but we must not take this to mean that rationality as such is evil, or that it is of only subordinate significance for mankind's existence as a whole. Rationality, in that high and genuine sense of which alone we are speaking, the primordial Greek sense which in the classical period of Greek philosophy had become an ideal, still requires, to be sure, much clarification through self-reflection, but it is called in its mature form to guide our development. On the other hand, we readily admit, and German idealism preceded us long ago in this insight, that the stage of development of ratio represented by the rationalism of the Age of Enlightenment was a mistake, though certainly an understandable one. Reason is a broad title. According to the old familiar definition, man is the rational animal, and in this broad sense even the Papuan is a man and not a beast. He has his ends, and he acts reflectively, considering the practical possibilities. The works and methods that grow out of this go to make up a tradition, being understandable again by others in virtue of their rationality. But just as man and even the Papuan represent a new stage of animal nature, i.e. as opposed to the beast, so philosophical reason represents a new stage of human nature and its reason. But the stage of human existence under ideal norms for infinite tasks, the stage of existence sub specie aeterni, is possible only through absolute universality, precisely the universality contained from the start in the idea of philosophy. True, universal philosophy, together with all the special sciences, makes up only a partial manifestation of European culture. Inherent in the sense of my whole presentation, however, is that this part is the functioning brain, so to speak, on whose normal function the genuine, healthy European spiritual life depends. The humanity of higher human nature, or reason, requires then a genuine philosophy. But now this is the danger point. Philosophy. Here, we must certainly distinguish between philosophy as a historical fact at a given time and philosophy as the idea of an infinite task. Any philosophy that exists at a given historical time is a more or less successful attempt to realize the guiding idea of the infinity, and at the same time even the totality of truths. Practical ideals, namely ideals discerned as eternal poles of which one cannot lose sight throughout one's whole life without compunction, without being untrue to oneself and thus becoming unhappy, are by no means always clearly and determinately discerned. They are anticipated in ambiguous generality. Determinateness results only when one concretely sets to work and succeeds, at least in a relative way. There is the constant threat of succumbing to one-sidedness and to premature satisfaction, which take their revenge in subsequent contradictions. Hence, the contrast between the great, common claims of the philosophical systems and the fact that they are nevertheless incompatible with one another. Also, there is the necessity, and at the same time the danger, of specialization. In this way, a one-sided rationality can certainly become an evil. One can also say, it belongs to the essence of reason that the philosophers at first understand and labor at their task in an absolutely necessary one-sided way. Actually, there is nothing perverse in this. It is not an error. Rather, as we said, the straight and necessary path they must take allows them to see only one side of the task. at first without noticing that the whole infinite task of theoretically knowing the totality of what is has other sides as well. If inadequacy announces itself through obscurities and contradictions, this motivates the beginning of a universal reflection. Thus, the philosopher must always devote himself to mastering the true and full sense of philosophy, the totality of its horizons of infinity. No line of knowledge, no single truth may be absolutized and isolated. Only through this highest form of self-consciousness, which itself becomes one of the branches of the infinite task, can philosophy fulfill its function of putting itself, and thereby a genuine humanity, on the road to realization. The awareness that this is the case itself belongs to the domain of philosophical knowledge at the level of highest self-reflection. Only through this constant reflexivity is a philosophy universal knowledge. I said that the way of philosophy passes through naivete. This is the place for the criticism offered by the irrationalism that is so highly esteemed today, or rather the place to unmask the naivete of that rationalism which is taken for philosophical rationality as such, which is admittedly characteristic of the philosophy of the whole modern period since the Renaissance, and which takes itself to be the true, i.e., universal rationalism. In this naivete, then, unavoidable as a beginning stage, are caught all the sciences whose beginnings were already developed in antiquity. To put it more precisely, the most general title for this naivete is objectivism, taking the form of the various types of naturalism, of the naturalization of the spirit. Old and new philosophies were and remain naively objectivist. In fairness, we must add, though, that the German idealism proceeding from Kant was passionately concerned with overcoming this naivete, which had already become very troublesome, though it was unable to attain the higher stage of reflexivity which is decisive for the new form of philosophy and of European humanity. I can make what has been said understandable only in rough outlines. Natural man, let us consider him as man in the pre-philosophical period, is directed toward the world in all his concerns and activities. The field of his life and his work is the surrounding world spread out spatio-temporally around him, of which he counts himself a part. This remains the case even in the theoretical attitude, which at first can be nothing other than that of the non-participating spectator of the world, whereby the world loses its mythical character. Philosophy sees in the world the universe of what is, and the world becomes the objective world as opposed to representations of the world, those which vary according to nation or individual subject. Thus, truth becomes objective truth. In this way, philosophy begins as cosmology. It is first, as it were, obviously, directed in its theoretical interest toward corporeal nature, since, after all, everything given in space-time has in any case, at least at its basis, the existential formula of corporeity. Men and animals are not merely bodies, but in the orientation toward the surrounding world they appear as something with bodily existence, and thus as realities ordered within universal space-time. In this sense, all psychic occurrences, those of the particular ego, such as experiencing, thinking, willing, have a certain objectivity. The life of the community, that of families, peoples, etc., then seems to be resolved into that of particular individuals as psychophysical objects. The spiritual interrelation of psychophysical causality lacks a purely spiritual continuity. Physical nature is everywhere involved. The historical course of development is prefigured in a determined way by this attitude toward the surrounding world. Even the most fleeting glance at the corporeity to be found in the surrounding world shows that nature is a homogeneous, totally interrelated whole, a world by itself, so to speak, encompassed by homogeneous space-time, divided into particular things, all being alike as res extensae, and determining one another causally. Quite rapidly, a first and great step of discovery is taken, namely the overcoming of the finitude of nature already conceived as an objective in itself, a finitude in spite of its open endlessness. Infinity is discovered, first in the form of the idealization of magnitudes, of measures, of numbers, figures, straight lines, poles, surfaces, etc. Nature, space, time become extendable idealiter to infinity, and divisible idealiter to infinity. From the art of surveying comes geometry, from the art of numbers, arithmetic, from everyday mechanics, mathematical mechanics, etc. Now, without its being advanced explicitly as a hypothesis, intuitively given nature and world are transformed into a mathematical world. the world of the mathematical natural sciences. Antiquity led the way. In its mathematics was accomplished the first discovery of both infinite ideals and infinite tasks. This becomes for all later times the guiding star of the sciences. What effect did the intoxicating success of this discovery of physical infinity have on the scientific mastery of the spiritual sphere? In the attitude directed toward the surrounding world, the constantly objectivistic attitude, everything spiritual appeared as if it were simply spread over the surface of physical bodies. Thus, the application to it of the natural scientific way of thinking seemed the obvious thing to do. Hence we find at the very beginnings of philosophy the materialism and determinism of Democritus. But the greatest spirits have recoiled from this and also from any sort of psychophysics in the more modern style. Since Socrates, man has become a theme in his specifically human qualities, as a person, man within the spiritual life of the community. Man still has a place within the order of the objective world, but for Plato and Aristotle, this world becomes a great theme in its own right. Here a remarkable split makes itself felt. The human belongs to the sphere of objective facts, but as persons, as egos, men have goals, ends, norms given by the tradition, norms of truth, eternal norms. Though the development weakened in antiquity, it was nevertheless not lost. Let us make the leap to the so-called modern period. With a burning enthusiasm, the infinite task of a mathematical knowledge of nature and of knowledge of the world in general is taken up. The immense successes in the knowledge of nature are now supposed to be shared by the knowledge of the spirit. Reason has demonstrated its force in relation to nature. Just as the sun is the one all-illuminating and warming sun, so reason is also the one reason. Descartes. The method of natural science must also disclose the secrets of the spirit. The spirit is real, objectively in the world, and is founded as such on the living body. Thus, the worldview immediately and dominantly assumes the form of a dualistic and specifically a psychophysical worldview. One causality, simply split into two sectors, encompasses the one world. The sense of rational explanation is everywhere the same, yet in such a way that all explanation of the spirit, if it is to be the sole and thus universal philosophical explanation, leads back to the physical. There can be no pure and self-enclosed explanatory inquiry into the spirit, a psychology or theory of spirit turned inward, extending from the ego, the psychic sphere of self-experience, to the alien psyche. The external path, the path of physics and chemistry, must be taken. All the beloved expressions about the community spirit, the will of the people, the ideal and political goals of nations, etc., are so much romanticism and mythology, arising out of a transposition by analogy of concepts that have a genuine meaning only in the sphere of individual persons. Spiritual being is fragmentary. To the question concerning the source of all our difficulties we must now reply. This objectivism, or this psychophysical worldview, in spite of its apparent obviousness, is naively one-sided and has constantly failed to be understood as such. The reality of the spirit as a supposed real annex to bodies, its supposed spatio-temporal being within nature, is an absurdity. What we must do, however, in connection with our problem of the crisis, is to show how it happens that the modern age, which has been so proud for centuries of its theoretical and practical successes, finally becomes involved in a growing dissatisfaction, indeed must view its situation as one of distress. In all the sciences distress is felt, ultimately as a distress concerning method. But our European distress, though it is not understood, concerns very many people. These are, throughout, problems which arise from the naivete through which objectivist science takes what it calls the objective world for the universe of all that is, without noticing that no objective science can do justice to the very subjectivity which accomplishes science. Someone who is raised on natural science takes it for granted that everything merely subjective must be excluded, and that the natural scientific method, exhibiting itself in subjective manners of representation, determines objectively. Thus he seeks what is objectively true even for the psychic. Here it is immediately assumed that the subjective that has been excluded by the physicist is to be investigated as the psychic in psychology, and then, naturally, in psychophysical psychology. But the researcher of nature does not make clear to himself that the constant fundament of his, after all subjective, work of thought is the surrounding life world. It is always presupposed as the ground, as the field of work upon which alone his questions, his methods of thought, make sense. where is that huge piece of method subjected to critique and clarification? That method that leads from the intuitively given surrounding world to the idealization of mathematics and to the interpretation of these idealizations as objective being. Einstein's revolutionary innovations concern the formulae through which the idealized and naively objectified physis is dealt with. But how formulae in general, how mathematical objectification in general receive meaning on the foundation of life and the intuitively given surrounding world, of this we learn nothing, and thus Einstein does not reform the space and time in which our vital life runs its course. Mathematical natural science is a wonderful technique for making inductions with an efficiency, a degree of probability, a precision, and a computability that were simply unimaginable in earlier times. As an accomplishment, it is a triumph of the human spirit. As for the rationality of its methods and theories, however, it is a thoroughly relative one. It even presupposes a fundamental approach that is itself totally lacking in rationality. Since the intuitively given surrounding world, this merely subjective realm, is forgotten in scientific investigation, the working subject is himself forgotten. The scientist does not become a subject of investigation. Accordingly, from this standpoint, the rationality of the exact sciences is of a piece with the rationality of the Egyptian pyramids. To be sure, since Kant we have an epistemology in its own right, and on the other hand there is psychology, which, with its claims to natural scientific exactness, seeks to be the universal fundamental science of the spirit. But our hope for true rationality, i.e. for true insight, is disappointed here as elsewhere. The psychologists do not notice at all that even they do not approach, in their subject matter, themselves as accomplishing scientists in their surrounding life world. They do not notice that they necessarily presuppose themselves in advance as communalized men in their surrounding world and their historical time, even by the very fact that they seek to attain truth in itself, as truth valid for anyone at all. Because of its objectivism, psychology is completely unable to obtain as its subject matter the soul in its own essential sense, which is, after all, the ego that acts and suffers. It may objectify and deal inductively with valuative experience, willing experience as connected with bodily life. But can it do this with ends, values, norms? Can it take reason as its subject matter, perhaps as a disposition? What is completely overlooked is the fact that objectivism, as the genuine accomplishment of an investigator oriented toward true norms, presupposes precisely those norms, and that objectivism thus is not meant to be based on facts, since facts are thereby already meant as truths rather than mere opinion. Of course, some sense the difficulties involved here, and so the battle over psychologism breaks out. But the repudiation of a psychological grounding of norms, especially of norms for truth in itself, accomplishes nothing. The need for a reform of the whole of modern psychology is felt more and more on all sides, but it is not yet understood that it has failed because of its objectivism, that it does not at all attain the proper essence of the spirit, that its isolation of the objectively conceived soul and its psychophysical reinterpretation of being in community are a mistake. To be sure, it has not been without results, and it has revealed many, even practically valuable, empirical rules. But it is not a true psychology any more than statistics about morals, with their no less valuable knowledge, constitute a moral science. But everywhere, in our time, the burning need for an understanding of the spirit announces itself, and lack of clarity about the methodical and material relation between the natural sciences and the humanistic disciplines has become almost unbearable. Dilthey, one of the greatest humanists, devoted the energies of his whole life to a clarification of the relation between nature and spirit, to a clarification of the accomplishment of psychophysical psychology, which, as he thought, needed to be complemented by a new descriptive, classifying psychology. Efforts by Windelband and Rickert have unfortunately not produced the desired insights. Like all the others, they remain caught up in objectivism. And this is especially true of the new reformers in psychology, who think that the fault lies entirely in the long-dominant prejudice of atomism and that a new era has dawned with holistic psychology. Footnote: Ganzheitspsychologie, i.e. Gestalt psychology. But the situation can never improve so long as the objectivism arising out of a natural attitude toward the surrounding world is not seen through in its naivete, and so long as the recognition has not emerged that the dualistic view of the world, in which nature and spirit are to count as realities in a similar sense, though one is built on the other causally, is a mistake. In all seriousness, I think that an objective science of the spirit, an objective theory of the soul, objective in the sense that it attributes to souls, to personal communities, in existence in the forms of space-time, has never existed and will never exist. The spirit, and indeed only the spirit, exists in itself and for itself, is self-sufficient, and in its self-sufficiency, and only in this way, it can be treated truly rationally, truly and from the ground up scientifically. As for nature, however, in its natural scientific truth, it is only apparently self-sufficient and can only apparently be brought by itself to rational knowledge in the natural sciences. For true nature in the sense of natural science is a product of the spirit that investigates nature and thus presupposes the science of the spirit. The spirit is, by its essence, capable of practicing self-knowledge, and as scientific spirit it is capable of practicing scientific self-knowledge, and this in an iterative way. Only in the knowledge belonging purely to the science of the spirit is the scientist not open to the objection that his own accomplishment conceals itself. Accordingly, it is a mistake for the humanistic disciplines to struggle with the natural sciences for equal rights. As soon as they concede to the latter their objectivity as self-sufficiency, they themselves fall prey to objectivism. But as they are now developed in their manifold disciplines, they lack the ultimate true rationality made possible by the spiritual worldview. Precisely this lack of a genuine rationality on all sides is the source of man's now unbearable lack of clarity about his own existence and his infinite tasks. These are inseparably united in one task. Only when the spirit returns from its naive, external orientation to itself and remains with itself and purely with itself can it be sufficient unto itself. But how did a beginning of such self-reflection occur? A beginning was not possible so long as sensationalism, or better, data psychologism, the psychology of the tabula rasa, commanded the field. Only when Brentano made the demand for psychology as a science of intentional experiences was an impulse given that could lead further, although Brentano himself had not yet overcome objectivism and psychological naturalism. The development of an actual method for grasping the fundamental essence of the spirit in its intentionalities, and for constructing from there an analysis of the spirit that is consistent in infinitum, led to transcendental phenomenology. It overcomes naturalistic objectivism and every sort of objectivism in the only possible way, namely through the fact that he who philosophizes proceeds from his own ego, and this purely as the performer of all his validities, of which he becomes the purely theoretical spectator. In this attitude, it is possible to construct an absolutely self-sufficient science of the spirit in the form of consistently coming to terms with oneself and with the world as spiritual accomplishment. Here, the spirit is not in or alongside nature. Rather, nature is itself drawn into the spiritual sphere. Also, the ego is then no longer an isolated thing alongside other such things in a pre-given world. In general, the serious mutual exteriority of ego persons, their being alongside one another, ceases in favor of an inward being for one another, and mutual interpenetration. But of all this we cannot speak here. No lecture could exhaust it. I hope to have shown, however, that the old rationalism, which was an absurd naturalism incapable of grasping at all the spiritual problems that immediately concern us, is not being revived here. The ratio presently under discussion is nothing other than the spirit's truly universal and truly radical coming to terms with itself in the form of universal responsible science, in which a completely new mode of scientific discipline is set in motion, where all conceivable questions of being and questions of norm, questions of what is called existence, existence, find their place. It is my conviction that intentional phenomenology has made of the spirit, qua spirit, for the first time a field of systematic experience and science, and has thus brought about the total reorientation of the task of knowledge. The universality of the absolute spirit surrounds everything that exists with an absolute historicity, to which nature is subordinated as a spiritual structure. Intentional phenomenology, and specifically transcendental phenomenology, was first to see the light through its point of departure and its methods. Only through it do we understand, and from the most profound reasons, what naturalistic objectivism is, and understand in particular that psychology, because of its naturalism, had to miss entirely the accomplishment, the radical and genuine problem, of the life of the spirit. 3. let us condense the fundamental notions presented here. The crisis of European existence, talked about so much today and documented in innumerable symptoms of the breakdown of life, is not an obscure fate, an impenetrable destiny. Rather, it becomes understandable and transparent against the background of the teleology of European history that can be discovered philosophically. The condition for this understanding, however, is that the phenomenon Europe be grasped in its central, essential nucleus. In order to be able to comprehend the disarray of the present crisis, we had to work out the concept of Europe as the historical teleology of the infinite goals of reason. We had to show how the European world was born out of ideas of reason, i.e. out of the spirit of philosophy. The crisis could then become distinguishable as the apparent failure of rationalism. The reason for the failure of a rational culture, however, as we said, lies not in the essence of rationalism itself, but solely in its being rendered superficial, in its entanglement in naturalism and objectivism. There are only two escapes from the crisis of European existence: the downfall of Europe in its estrangement from its own rational sense of life, its fall into hostility toward the spirit and into barbarity, or the rebirth of Europe from the spirit of philosophy through a heroism of reason that overcomes naturalism once and for all. Europe's greatest danger is weariness. If we struggle against this greatest of all dangers as good Europeans, with the sort of courage that does not fear even an infinite struggle, then out of the destructive blaze of lack of faith, the smoldering fire of despair over the West's mission for humanity, the ashes of great weariness, will rise up the phoenix of a new life inwardness and spiritualization as the pledge of a great and distant future for man. For the spirit alone is immortal.